Welcome. This is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And this is Exploration. Every week on Exploration, we discuss the fascinating world of science and its impact on society. And today, leading off, we're going to summarize some of the big stories in science. First of all, on our lead story, we're going to go to the movies. That's right, we're going to go to the movies where there's a new movie called Blade Runner 2049 that's attracting a lot of media attention. So far, the box office draw has not been as great as expected. However, the reviews were fantastic. And the question is, well, Blade Runner is based on the idea that one day robots will be pretty much like human beings. And the question is, how close was Blade Runner to the actual truth? The first movie came out in the 1980s, and it predicted that by the year 2019, 2 years from now, in 2019, robots would be pretty much like us. Now, the new movie has it 30 years later, 2049. And so the question is, what went wrong? I mean, we had movies like 2001, which came out in 1968. And boy, was that movie also wrong. So why were all these projections made in the 60s, 70s, 80s, why were they all wrong? And for that matter, when might they be realized? When might we have robots that look, well, just like us? And also, a cosmic mystery has been solved in outer space. Just recently, scientists observed the collision of two neutron stars in deep space, and we found, bingo, that's the origin of gold. Now, gold, of course, is pretty much everywhere in your wedding ring, jewelry, and at Fort Knox. But the question that has intrigued scientists for generations is, where does gold come from? I mean, during the Middle Ages, alchemists tried to create gold out of lead using something called the Philosopher's Stone. Well, today we don't believe in that, of course, because we have something called nuclear physics. But that left open the mystery. Where does gold and platinum, where do they come from anyway? They don't seem to fit any known sequence of events. But now we have the clue from the gravity wave detectors, which are now being used as telescopes to peer into the heart of black holes and neutron stars. And also, we'll say a few things about cancer therapy. And immunotherapy is maturing very fast and could be the next major weapon in our arsenal against cancer. Cancer is the second leading cause of death in the United States. So we'll say a few things about the new therapies that attack cancer at the genetic and cellular level. Well, let's just jump right into some of the top stories of the past week. As I said before, we're going to go to the movies. A lot of us love the movies. However, many times movie makers, even though they have the movie magic of special effects, sometimes they get the science a little bit wrong. Back in 1968, we had that path-breaking film 2001. It was a real eye-opener, but it predicted that back in the 1990s, we would already begin to have robots that we can talk to. And of course, the movie was set in the year 2001. Now we expect that we'll perhaps have the first moon base, manned moon base, perhaps in the next 15 years or so. And so the movie was off by perhaps 50 to 70 years. And so then the question is, why? And for that matter, Blade Runner, which was a pioneering film which came out in the 1980s, it predicted that by the year 2019, we would have replicants. That is, robots to do the dirty work of humans in outer space. However, these robots look just like us. They reason like us, talk like us. In fact, they are pretty much indistinguishable from us. And if you read the movie reviews, there's even a theory that Harrison Ford was really a robot all along. And so the question is, what went wrong with all these predictions? Well, back in the 1950s, when artificial intelligence first got off the ground, things looked so easy. Computers were becoming more powerful. They could begin to play checkers. Then they begin to play chess. Then they begin to play more complicated games. And as a consequence, mathematicians got, well, hyped up. They thought that within a summer or two, they said, we're going to begin to have robots that are just as smart as us. Well, boy, were they wrong. So what was the origin of this mistake that lasted for 50 years? Well, 50 years ago, scientists made a huge mistake in artificial intelligence. They assumed that the human brain was a digital computer. However, if you think about it, the human brain actually has very little in common with a digital computer. First of all, the brain has no programming that we're aware of. We've taken apart the brain, and sure enough, we don't see Windows there. We don't see Fortran. We don't see Belgal. We don't see any computer language inside the brain. So there's no programming. Second of all, computers have a chip, like a Pentium chip, but there's no Pentium chip in the brain. You can pick apart the brain, neuron by neuron, and sure enough, there are no central processors, no CPUs inside the brain. Next, you can remove half the brain, and the brain still functions. In fact, there was a young girl once who complained about headaches. They scanned her brain, and they were shocked to find that she had literally half a brain. So the brain can function with 50% of its mass missing. However, if you have one transistor out of place inside a computer, the whole computer will malfunction. So the brain has no subroutines. It has no CPU. It has no central processor, no Pentium chip, no programming. And then the question is, what is it there for? Well, that was the mistake, thinking that digital computers would be the guiding path to unlock the secrets of the human brain and artificial intelligence. Boy, were we wrong. So the approach back then was called a top-down approach. That is, let's write a computer program with all the laws of Mother Nature in it so that you plug this disk into a computer and the computer suddenly says, I am aware. I think. I am like a human. That was the goal, a top-down approach. That is one gigantic disk with all the lines of intelligence on it. You insert it into a computer and bingo, you have a robot like Hal in the movie 2001. Well, wrong. Now we realize that the brain is not a digital computer at all. It's something totally different. It's a learning machine called a neural network. It literally rewires itself after learning every task. So now, 50 years after we made that mistake back in the 1950s, scientists are introducing something called deep learning. Deep learning is a program that actually learns a little bit, slow as it may seem. However, it's something that we should have investigated 50 years ago. I mean, think about it. Your laptop today is just as stupid as it was yesterday. Your laptop never learns anything. It makes the same mistakes over and over and over again. But you see, our brain operates on the bottom-up approach. It constantly makes mistakes. It bumps into things. It learns from these mistakes and moves on. We all know the secret to go to Carnegie Hall if you are a musician. The secret is practice, practice, practice. You see, with every practice, your neural nets become closer and closer to the correct one. And that's how we learn, by trial and error, by bumping into things. So now scientists are slowly beginning to adopt the bottom-up and the top-down approach. Because after all, that's how we learn in high school and college. The bottom-up approach is to bump into things and learn things the hard way, the school of hard knocks. The top-down approach is learning from a book, like learning calculus from a book. And so the combination of the two, bottom-up and top-down approach, is perhaps the way to go. So when might we have robots that are just like us? Well, I think we were way off. I think perhaps late in this century, we may begin to approach the intelligence of a human being. Right now, our robots are as smart as a cockroach, as smart as a bug. Even bugs can zip around obstacles, find mates, find food. Our most advanced robots, you put them in the middle of a street, what do? They get lost. That's what they do. However, eventually they'll be as smart as a mouse, then as smart as a rat, then as smart as a rabbit, then as smart as a cat, a dog, and finally, perhaps by the end of the century, as smart as a monkey. At that point, they could be dangerous. Just like in the movie 2001, we had a murderous robot that took over the functions of a rocket ship. Yeah, that's possible. I don't think it's possible till late in the century. As Rodney Brooks, former director of the MIT famous Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, once told me on Exploration, he said that the probability that someone's going to invent a humanoid robot anytime soon is equivalent to the probability of a hurricane creating a Boeing C-47 jet out of debris. In other words, it ain't going to happen anytime soon. However, it could happen in the future, in which case humans may have to be worried a bit about the job market. Because, of course, robots, as they get smarter, will start to replace human-type jobs. But some jobs will be out of touch of robots for quite a while. For example, semi-skilled, non-repetitive workers like plumbers, like carpenters, like construction workers, like gardeners, like policemen. They require a level of pattern recognition and common sense that's way beyond anything that we can create in the laboratory. So these kinds of jobs, specialized jobs for semi-skilled workers, those jobs are going to be with us for a long time to come. The real losers in this game is A, repetitive workers. Workers that do the same motion over and over again. Those jobs are on the way out. Also, jobs that involve search engines like paralegals. Those jobs are on the way out. And also, middlemen jobs. You got to be careful. Brokers, for example, they're going to be on the way out unless they add something to their menu of abilities. That is intellectual capital. That is expertise. That is knowledge, experience, imagination, innovation, know-how. These are the things that robots don't have. And so brokers are right in the crosshairs of the computer revolution. They will survive only if they begin to adopt intellectual capital, capital of the mind, rather than using your hands and building on commodities. And so, in some sense, robots are going to become more proliferated into the job market, but there are three things that robots cannot do. The three things are, first of all, work with humans and understand human behavior and personality. That's why we're going to have lawyers in the future. Lawyers can talk to juries. Lawyers can talk to judges. They can argue cases. They can appeal to the sensibilities of the jury. Robots cannot. Robots are clueless when it comes to human relations because, well, quite frankly, human relations are so complicated. So that's one area where robots cannot excel. Another area is pattern recognition. They don't understand what they see. They can barely see the line, circles, squares inside a room rather than seeing table and stool and book. They don't see objects for what they are. Pattern recognition is still very weak, and common sense is also very weak. They don't know that water is wet. They don't know that when you die, you don't come back the next day. They don't know that mothers are older than their daughters. Now, everybody knows that. Yeah, humans know that, but robots do not. Now, I'm not saying that you can't get a robot as intelligent as a human being. I'm just saying that the problem is much more difficult than people thought back in the 1950s when they first created something called artificial intelligence. We now realize that the brain is very complicated. It's a parallel processor. It does not have a Pentium chip at all. It does trillions of calculations simultaneously, while a computer does one calculation at a time. Now, you've probably seen some calculations showing that by 2045 or so, robots are going to be as smart as us, and beyond that, better than us. Well, not so fast. Maybe, maybe not. But that calculation is based on something called Moore's Law. Moore's Law says the computer power doubles every 18 months. But Moore's Law, that we depend upon to have Christmas presents twice as powerful as the previous Christmas, that law is slowing down. That's right. Computer power is no longer doubling at the rate of 18 months per doubling cycle. So, eventually, perhaps in 10, 15 years, Moore's Law could collapse. Why? Because computer chips, like a Pentium chip, has a layer maybe 20 atoms across. Well, in 5 to 10 years, that layer is going to be 5 atoms across. And at that point, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle kicks in. You don't know where the electron is anymore, and the whole thing goes kaput. So we have to create a new generation of computers, optical computers, DNA computers, quantum dot computers, protein computers, quantum computers. However, unfortunately, none of them are ready yet for prime time. And so we had this debate recently between Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. Mark Zuckerberg saying that robots will give us plenty of jobs and prosperity, while Elon Musk says, the robots are going to take over. They're going to push us aside. This is an existential threat to humanity. Who's right? I think in the short term, Zuckerberg is right. That is, artificial intelligence is going to reinvigorate the economy, create tremendous jobs. In fact, I think the AI industry will eventually be bigger than the automobile industry, because the automobile is going to become a robot. You'll talk to it. You'll argue with it. It'll drive the car. It'll park itself. You simply tell the car to park, and it parks all by itself. Well, that future, of course, is still many decades away. Well, gold is in the stars. This made tremendous headlines in the scientific community because we had this cosmic mystery. Where does gold come from? Well, of course, gold is found in your wedding band, is found in Fort Knox, but what is the origin of gold? During the Middle Ages, chemists or alchemists thought that perhaps you could turn lead into gold. Wrong. You can't do that. That requires a nuclear reaction. So where does gold come from? Well, first of all, where do the elements of our body come from? Oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, the hydrocarbon chemistry that makes up the proteins of our body. Where does that come from? Well, we know the answer to that. It comes from the stars. We are literally made of stardust. A star is an oven that cooks hydrogen to eventually create helium. Then it cooks helium to create lithium. And it creates lithium, burns lithium to create beryllium, and so on and so forth. The lighter elements of the body are cooked in stars, dwarf stars, like white dwarf stars. And so we have a very good understanding of the origin of the lighter elements. But then we have a problem. Where do the heavy elements come from? You cannot cook heavy elements inside a star. Stars are not hot enough to cook the heavy elements. Basically, there are too many protons inside these larger nuclei, and these protons don't like each other. Therefore, you have to heat them to tremendous temperatures, not billions, but trillions of degrees, in order to create higher elements. But stars do not fire up at trillions of degrees. And so then the question is, if a star is an oven and cannot fire up to trillions of degrees, then what can? Where did gold come from? Well, there was some speculation that gold came from the collision of neutron stars, but hey, that was just a speculation until last month. Scientists finally nailed it to the wall. The Nobel Prize, of course, was given to 3 physicists last month for the creation of a gravity wave detector that detects gravity waves from the collision of black holes. But not only that, it will also detect radiation from the collision of neutron stars. And bingo, the LIGO detector found evidence of a collision between 2 neutron stars 130 million light years from the planet Earth. And out of that collision came gold. So we now have the missing piece of the puzzle. So we now can understand where the elements come from. Hydrogen, helium came from the Big Bang. The elements beyond that were cooked in stars going up to iron. The elements slightly above iron came from exploding stars. But the higher elements now, gold and uranium and platinum, they came from the collision of 2 neutron stars. Now, what is a neutron star? A neutron star, like a black hole, is a dead star. But it's a black hole wannabe. It's too small to become a black hole. A neutron star is like what was found here, only weighs about 20% or 50% more than the sun. In other words, a little bit bigger than a star. However, black holes can be 50 to 1,000,000 times more massive than a single star. So here we had the collision of 2 neutron stars being very dense. The neutron star is so dense, in fact, that a teaspoon of this material would weigh as much as Mount Everest. That's right. That is how dense the material of a neutron star is. But it's not dense enough to create a black hole. A black hole is even denser than a neutron star. So think of a neutron star as a black hole wannabe. And they can orbit around each other. And when they orbit around each other, the orbit will eventually decay and they'll plow into each other, creating a collision like the one that was picked up by the LIGO detectors in Louisiana and Washington State. In fact, it earned these three physicists the Nobel Prize in Physics to create the LIGO detector. So in other words, a new branch of astronomy has opened up. Galileo introduced the telescope, which uses light radiation. Then during World War II, we had radio telescopes, which could peer not just into planets and stars, but into galaxies. Now we have the third generation of telescopes, gravity wave telescopes, and they in turn can peer right into colliding black holes, colliding neutron stars, and eventually the creation of the universe itself. And speaking about the great universe of ours, it turns out that the federal government has now okayed a second therapy against cancer, one of the greatest threats to life in the United States. Cancer, in fact, is the second leading cause of death in America. And for generations, we didn't even know what it was. That's right. When President Nixon declared war against cancer back in the 1970s, well, many people thought that cancer was like a bacteria or a virus. We can cure those using antibiotics and vaccines, so of course we can cure cancer. Wrong. We now know that cancer is really not like the other diseases at all. It is not caused by an external agent so much as a miswiring of its own programming. In other words, it is the enemy inside us. It is ordinary cells that go berserk that become cancerous, rather than the body being attacked by external agents like bacteria and viruses. Now, some bacteria and viruses can create cancer on their own. However, in the main, cancer is a genetic disease. It's a disease caused by the breakdown of 4 major genes inside the body. That's why it takes so long to get cancer, because 1 major mutation won't do it. 2 won't do it. You need about 4 major mutations in a cell before it becomes cancerous, and that's why it takes decades for cancer to form. In fact, when you're a child, believe it or not, if you're a child and you get a very severe sunburn in one spot, like in your thigh, for example, then, believe it or not, 40, 30 years later, you may get skin cancer at that very same spot where you had that horrible X-ray, horrible sunburn as a child. So what is cancer? It's a genetic mutation in 4 major genes, which can be triggered by any number of factors. Cigarette smoke will do it. Too much animal fat will do it. It turns out that, as I mentioned earlier, X-rays will do it. Any number of things, including viruses, can do it. And so that's why it's so difficult to cure cancer. However, the federal government has okayed not 1, but 2 new therapies called immunotherapy. You see, cancer that's formed in the body is actually recognized by the body, and the body kills cancers all the time. Otherwise, we would have died years and years ago. So what happened? Our body originally had the capability of identifying cancer cells and killing them. But eventually, cancer cells mutate themselves. They begin to develop a protein coat around themselves that makes them invisible to our immune system, so our immune system can no longer attack cancer. So what we do is we take the immune cells out of our body, genetically modify them so they can recognize the protein coat of a cancer cell, reinsert these killer immune cells back into the body, and bingo, they can then target cancer cells one by one. Well, what's the catch? This is such a great idea. It's used against people with terminal illnesses who have no hope whatsoever. Scientists have given up on these people. These are the people that are being cured by immunotherapy. What's the catch? Well, first of all, it's very expensive. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars because the manufacturers, of course, have to recoup the losses of research. Second of all, tremendous side effects. If you can survive the side effects, horrible side effects, then perhaps you have a second lease on life. And it's not 100% effective, but hey, if you have a fatal illness and this is your last hope, then you may seriously think about shelling out the $300,000 or so necessary to cure cancer. I should mention that immunotherapy is one of several new therapies. The next therapy being looked at is nanoparticles. Nanoparticles are molecules that can home in on cancers and inject a poison in them one by one, thereby killing them. So this is still in the experimental stage. It's not at the stage of being okayed by the government, but nanoparticles, that is, smart bombs, tiny little molecular smart bombs that zero in on individual cancers and kill them one by one. This is perhaps a new development in cancer research. However, it's still very experimental. Immunotherapy, on the other hand, two of them have now been okayed by the government. So far, we have surgery to slice the cancer, we have chemotherapy to poison the cancer, and we have surgery to slice out the cancer. But none of the three cures the cancer or isolates the cancer one by one. That's what these new therapies can do, attack cancer one by one. So instead of a shotgun, which can kill ordinary cells as well as cancer cells, instead of having a shotgun, we have a rifle, a smart bomb that can zero in on cancer cells one by one. And that gives us real hope that one day we'll be able to cure one of the greatest killers, the second leading killer in the United States, which is cancer. I have to point out, however, that at the present time there is still no cure for cancer. And ultimately, I personally think that perhaps there will never be a single cure for all forms of cancer. It turns out that cancer is not one disease, but perhaps thousands of different kinds of diseases depending upon which mutations occur within the cell. So that doesn't mean that a cure is not possible. It just means that the quest to find an overall cure for cancer is dimming as we know more and more about the enormous variety and causes of what causes our cells to go haywire. So once again, I would hope that in the future we do have a cure for cancer, but eventually we may treat cancer like the common cold. That is, the common cold really doesn't kill anyone unless you have pneumonia or something. And for the most part, we simply live with it. We can tolerate it because it's not that harmful. So eventually, I think we'll treat cancer sort of like the common cold. That is, it's not going to kill people. It'll be a nuisance, but it'll be a nuisance that is extremely hard to fully get rid of. Well, I'm afraid that's it for the first part of exploration. In the second part of exploration, because we are talking about artificial intelligence, we're going to bring on Ray Kurzweil, a computer scientist now with Google, who talks about what is called the singularity. So the question is, what happens now in the future? In the future, when robots become increasingly more intelligent, and some people think that one day they'll match human intelligence and perhaps even exceed it. Well, perhaps the dates for when this is going to happen, I think, have been exaggerated, but you can't rule it out. The day when robots begin to rival human intelligence. And so we're going to bring on Ray Kurzweil of Google speaking about the singularity. Welcome. Once again, this is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and this is the second half of Exploration. In the first half of Exploration, well, we went to the movies, and in particular, we were talking about Blade Runner 2049. And the question is, well, why did science fiction get everything so wrong in terms of the timetable for artificial intelligence? In the movie 2001, which came out in 1968, it predicted that by 2001, we would already have artificially intelligent programs that we can talk to, that can run spaceships, and boy, was that wrong. And then in Blade Runner, which came out in the 1980s, it predicted that by the year 2019, just 2 years from now, We would be sending human-like robots into deep space to do the dirty work, colonizing and mining the solar system. So what went wrong with all these predictions? Well, of course, the main reason why we got everything wrong is because we thought that the brain was a digital computer. And simply by mimicking digital computers, we would somehow get insight into the human brain. Now we realize that that ultimate goal is a lot more distant than we previously thought. However, now we are building learning machines. They're called deep learning, and we're slowly making inroads. So one day, perhaps robots will be able to recognize handwriting, perhaps recognize the human voice, perhaps recognize the human face. So perhaps we'll be able to identify people rather accurately in the future. But what happens further down the line when robots can do more than that and begin to mimic human behavior? That is, what happens when they exceed human intelligence? That's called the singularity, the tipping point when robots become smarter than us, and maybe they have progeny who are smarter than them, and then they can escalate that extremely rapidly, exponentially, and maybe even one day take over. But with us today is Ray Kurzweil, who works now for Google, and we're going to talk to him about the so-called singularity. What happens when robots match and eventually perhaps exceed human intelligence? We can debate about the timetable, but it is a legitimate question to ask, when will they become human-like?
Mr. Kurzweil, the first question for you is, how did you first get interested in robots and artificial intelligence?
I've actually had mine being an inventor since I was at the age of 5. And age of 12, I discovered computers. I built some primitive computers myself and got access to one as part of a summer job, and quickly became fascinated with the ability to kind of model the world, albeit primitively at that time, in the computer and create virtual realities, and also model a lot of thinking processes. Quickly became interested actually in pattern recognition, which is my view is the fundamental basis of human intelligence rather than logical, sequential, analytical thinking. And a project I did in high school was to build pattern recognition models of melodies, and I would feed in the melodies of Mozart or Chopin, and it would build a pattern recognition model and then write original melodies in the same style from that model, which were recognizable, kind of sounded like second-rate compositions from a second-rate student of Chopin or Mozart. And that started really a lifelong fascination in pattern recognition, which is really my primary technical field.
Okay, and let's talk about your book, The Age of Spiritual Machines. First of all, what is a spiritual machine? Is that a contradiction in terms?
The primary concept of spirituality is really consciousness. If we consider a being or an entity to be conscious, then we consider it to have spiritual value. And if you look at all the different religious traditions, what they really mean by a soul and by spiritual reality is consciousness, an entity that really has subjective experience and can feel pain and joy, as opposed to just the conventional concept of a machine, which is operating by some kind of automatic process. And we don't worry much today about causing pain and suffering to our computer programs. But our computer software is still millions of times simpler than the human brain. We do find, if we look at the human brain, that we actually can model it with great precision neurons and even substantial clusters of neurons. We can talk more about that. And we will have machines, which is to say non-biological entities, that do have the complexity and richness and depth of the human brain, indeed modeled on the principles of operation of the human brain within a few decades. And when these entities claim to be conscious, to be joyful, fearful, angry, and so on, unlike, let's say, the computer characters in video games today, those entities a few decades from now will be as convincing as humans. They'll have all the subtle emotional cues that we associate with somebody really having those subjective experiences. So are they conscious? some philosophers will say, no, they're not squirting human neurotransmitters. You can't be conscious if you're not biological. But there won't be any clear distinction. We won't be able to separate them from any kind of objective observation. And my prediction, and this is really not a philosophical statement, but a psychological and political prediction, is that the bulk of humans, unenhanced humans, will consider these non-biological entities to be conscious. In any event, they'll be very intelligent. They'll be able to convince us that they're conscious, and they'll get angry at us if we don't believe them. And it'll be an actual political and legal issue as well. In my view, the real issue of consciousness is not something we can resolve scientifically, because science involves third-party objective observation. Consciousness is inherently first-party subjective experience, and there is a gap there. Some people go on to say, well, since it's not scientific, it's not an important question. I would turn that around and say it's really a very fundamental question. It shows that there is a need for philosophy outside of science. But these will become real compelling questions as opposed to just abstract philosophical debate in this 21st century.
Okay, and let's talk about the past first as a guide to the future. Back in the 1950s and 60s, there were dazzling breakthroughs in artificial intelligence theory. We had the first machines, for example, that could play chess and checkers, not very well, but they could at least play the game. They could solve simple algebra theorems. They could even play doctor to a degree and do simple diagnoses. And there were all these fantastic predictions that just within a few years, humans will be put in a zoo. We'll all be zoo animals, and our creations will throw peanuts at us and make us dance behind bars, because look at how fast computers are learning. And then there was the movie 2001. And, well, the year 2001 came and went, and we still do not have the robot Hal, the murderous robot in Arthur C. Clarke's famous movie that could pilot a spaceship, could play chess, and interact with humans as if it was a human itself. So the question is, what happened to the dream of the 1950s and 60s when everyone was predicting that humans would be obsolete by the 1970s?
Well, your observation is correct. I would say wasn't everyone predicting that. There were some famous predictions from Simon and Newell at Carnegie Mellon, which came into disrepute. But there was over-optimism because machines were doing adult activities like solving some unsolved theorems from Russell and Whitehead and playing chess, in some narrow cases making medical diagnoses as well as doctors and so on. So it seemed it wouldn't be long before a computer could do everything. Another 10 years went by and we realized that computers, while they were able to do these high-level analytic tasks, were not able to do some things that a 4-year-old can do, which is, let's say, tell the difference between a dog and a cat or recognize faces. And this is really a fundamental issue, in my view, that the fundamental basis of human intelligence is not analytic, logical thinking. And in fact, machines can do that a lot better than humans in most cases. The fundamental basis of human intelligence is pattern recognition. We can see that in the contrast with how machines play chess, which is the minimax combinatorial expansion of move counter moves, which it does largely through brute force. We can look at millions or even hundreds of millions of board positions in a second. Kasparov says he looked at less than one board position in a second, but humans use their tremendous powers of pattern recognition to recognize situations they've thought about before. And we don't think fast enough. Our interneuronal connections compute 200 calculations per second, which is about 10 to 100 million times slower than electronic circuits, but we have 100 trillion of them, all computing simultaneously, self-organizing. Information is really represented as a pattern. No key connection is all that important. It's a very different paradigm from computers we're used to, and it's a very good architecture for recognizing patterns in a profound way. That is really the heart of human intelligence. Now, we have been making steady progress in pattern recognition. I could give many examples of that, both in terms of recognizing language and speech, character recognition. Have all improved gradually. Even in chess, machines have become better qualitative players. So you have Deep Fritz and the current programs working actually as well as Deep Blue, despite the fact that they're about 100 times slower, that they're doing a better job of pattern recognition. So we are making steady progress on that, and that is really the key issue now. And part of the guidance we'll get in terms of creating the templates of human-level pattern recognition is to actually understand how humans do it, which brings up the issue of reverse engineering the human brain. It wasn't long ago before people were saying, well, our intelligence is just below the level necessary to actually understand our own intelligence. But what we're finding is that as we're able to actually instrument the brain and see what's going on, and our ability to scan the human brain and to actually see the connections and the firings of interneuronal connections and synapses is increasing, actually doubling every year, we are able to develop very detailed mathematical models of neurons and neuron clusters. Lloyd Watts and his colleagues have actually created a reverse engineering of the whole acoustic area of the brain involving 12 different regions with a great deal of detail, have re-implemented that in software and submitted that to psychoacoustic tests, which performs very comparably to human auditory perception. If you follow all the exponential trends in computation, communication, brain scanning, exponentially growing knowledge of the human brain, it's, I think, conservative to say we will have reverse engineered the principles of operation of the human brain within a quarter century. And that will provide us more powerful biologically inspired methods for pattern recognition.
Okay, well, we've had several AI specialists on the radio show before, among them Rodney Brooks of MIT, the director of the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And I asked him a key question, and that is, well, how powerful are the MIT robots? And he was very proud to say that he's the godfather of the Mars rover, an advanced robot which actually wandered on the surface of Mars. But he was honest and said that his most advanced robots have the intelligence of a cockroach. In fact, cockroaches do it a lot better, he said. Cockroaches can scope out environments, see obstacles, boulders, maneuver around them, and they're quite good at this. And robots at Carnegie Mellon and Stanford, well, when they walk down the hall, it's lucky if they don't gouge out a piece of the wallpaper when they walk down the walk down the hallway. So how smart are our robots? Are our robots really so dumb that they are really insect level at the present time, barely able to understand chairs, tables, the ceiling, the roof, people maneuvering around the room? How smart are the robots today?
Well, robots and artificial intelligence in general are operating far below biological levels, both in terms of hardware and software. And I think it's worthwhile talking about both of those, but also to understand that we're making exponential progress in both of these realms. And exponential progress really sneaks up on you. And just to use an analogy, Kasparov played the best machines in the 1990 at chess, and they were pathetic, and he scoffed at them. And it was just inconceivable that they would ever reach this level. But they gradually got better. They're doubling in performance every year, gaining 40 chess points every year, and chess scale is exponential. And then they surpassed him, operating at or beyond his level by 1997. We'll see the same thing in other areas. And it's easy to lose sight of tremendous power of exponential growth. We are doubling computation at least every year, and we'll talk a little bit later about the issue of Moore's Law, but I believe that this phenomenon will continue past Moore's Law into three-dimensional computing. And in terms of software, we're making exponential progress, as I mentioned, in understanding and reverse engineering the principles of operation of the human brain. There's a new brain scanning method now that's being developed, which will be available within a couple of years, that will actually be able to see individual nerve fibers firing in a cluster of thousands of neurons at very high resolution, very high resolution also in terms of time scale, which will really give us the means to reverse engineer those circuits. I mean, so far, we've been really unable to see what's going on. It's very hard to diagnose a circuit if you can't instrument it. But if you can put sensors on in the right place and see what's going on, it's very straightforward to reverse engineer. The human brain, of course, is created by a genome that doesn't have very much information in it. Even though the human brain itself appears to contain thousands of trillions of bytes, the genome only has about 12 million bytes of information to characterize the initial design of the brain, because there's a lot of random wiring in the way it's actually constructed, which then self-organizes to reflect its experience with the world. So the principles of operation are of a complexity that we can't understand, and that will provide us at least biologically inspired paradigms for the software of intelligence. So the capabilities of all of these systems will improve quite steadily, and we will master different levels of biological intelligence. Ultimately, I believe within less than 3 decades, by 2029, these machines will be operating at human levels and will combine human levels of intelligence, the subtlety and suppleness of human pattern recognition with some of the natural advantages of machines, most notable of which is the ability to instantly share knowledge.
Now let's talk a little bit about Moore's Law, the doubling time you mentioned of 18 months for computers, meaning that at Christmas time, your computers are almost twice as powerful as they were the previous Christmas. Exponential growth in bacteria, for example, eventually seals off. Otherwise, bacteria would take over the entire planet Earth. And exponential factors do taper off because of external effects. Now, with Moore's Law and computers, the engine driving Moore's Law is ultraviolet etching technology, by which we can etch tinier and tinier transistors on a silicon wafer the size of your thumb. But eventually the transistors get so tiny, you hit the quantum theory. And at that point, you get short circuits. Leakage takes place. All hell breaks loose. And by 2020, all bets are off. The Intel, one of the senior engineers at Intel, admitted recently in a major paper that, yes, they can see the end of the tunnel. And that is, at a certain point, it's going to be prohibitively difficult to etch silicon components that are tinier and tinier, and eventually you get leakage because you don't know where the electrons are. Some people have said, let's make 3-dimensional cubes. But the problem there is you have heat generation, enormous quantities of heat generated in 3-dimensional cubes. So the question is, what happens after 2020 when all hell breaks loose and Silicon Valley becomes a rust belt?
Well, it's a key question, and to examine that, I've done a number of things. I have been an ardent student of technology trends. I've been measuring the actual power of different technologies for 25 years. I have a team of people doing that. One thing I did is put 49 famous computers over the last century, long before there was a Moore's Law, on an exponential chart. And this exponential growth has been going on not just for Moore's Law, but back through 5 different paradigms. Moore's Law, the shrinking of transistors on a flat integrated circuit, was not the first, but the 5th paradigm to provide exponential growth to computing. And every time one paradigm ran out of steam, because as you correctly point out, every method of exponential growth eventually runs out of capacity. Rabbits in Australia eat up the vegetation and stop growing exponentially, even reverse direction. Every time that happened, another paradigm came along and started another S-curve of exponential growth. They were shrinking vacuum tubes to continue exponential growth. Finally, they couldn't shrink them anymore and keep the vacuum. That paradigm ended. Transistors came along. And the next paradigm will be 3-dimensional computing. We live in a 3-dimensional world. Our brains are organized in 3 dimensions. Our brain, by the way, uses a very cumbersome, very slow electrochemical information processing method that 200 calculations per second. They're digitally controlled analog transactions, but they're roughly comparable to calculations, at least 10 million times slower than electronic circuits. But it gets its tremendous power from the fact that it's organized in 3 dimensions. Now, the brain itself is an existence proof of the feasibility of organizing circuits in 3 dimensions and dealing with the heat problem. I proposed 3-dimensional computing as the 6th paradigm to replace Moore's Law, which was the 5th paradigm in my book, The Age of Spiritual Machines, 4 years ago. It was considered a radical notion then. I would say it's much more of a mainstream expectation at this time. There's been tremendous progress in building working three-dimensional circuits over the last 4 years. There's been a steady flow of breakthroughs, including conceptual examinations of this thermal issue that you alluded to. And there are ways of designing the circuits in porous ways to deal with the heat issue. 1 watt of power, which would not generate that much heat, would be sufficient to emulate human brain capacity in a cube that would be very tiny. So the thermal issue is, in fact, a key challenge, but there's a lot of confidence that that's feasible. And we still have at least a dozen years to go. And what we've seen typically is when the end is in sight for a particular paradigm, it creates tremendous pressure in the R&D community to create the next paradigm. And we have a lot of advance warning this time. And already, in fact, just using conventional lithography and going to the third dimension, because after all, even conventional circuits have 14 or 15 layers of material, so they do have some three-dimensional capacity. And there's been successful efforts to build circuits with dozens and even up to 100 layers of circuitry just using conventional techniques. There are many different approaches. The most effective appears to be carbon nanotubes, which is what I had predicted in my book 4 years ago.
Okay, well, the heat problem, as you mentioned, is quite fierce. Engineers tell me that very soon, even cubicle computers will generate so much heat you can fry an egg on them. Let me ask you a question about the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. When we had Rodney Brooks on the radio, he said that there are 2 approaches to artificial intelligence, top-down and bottom-up. The top-down approach has dominated AI research for the last several decades, and the goal there is to have a CD-ROM with all the laws of common sense, all the laws of logic on it. You simply put the CD-ROM in a computer, and all of a sudden your computer says, I think, I am aware, I am conscious, okay, I'm alive. That's the top-down approach, which failed rather miserably. We know that there are hundreds of millions of lines of common sense. We can't put them on a CD-ROM. There's so many of them. The other one is a bottom-up approach, which follows nature, Mother Nature, allowing machines to learn like bugs, like infants, to bump into the environment. And that approach is like a neural network approach. So could you explain to us a little bit about neural network theory? And this, of course, means that our brain, in some sense, is not really a digital computer at all. That perhaps we were sort of misled over the last 50 years in terms of the successes of silicon, but the brain is really a neural network and not really a Turing machine at all. Could you elaborate?
Well, I've always been a strong advocate of what you're referring to as the bottom-up approach. As I mentioned earlier, the brain, the design of it, characterized by only about 12 million bytes of compressed information in the genome. You might wonder, how could that be when the brain itself contains millions of times more information than that? And the way it works is the genome specifies a particular design, but in a particular region, the actual wiring of the connection is random within certain constraints. And we know that that's the case, having watched how that process unfolds. Then there's actually kind of an evolutionary process where the connections that make the most sense in the environment survive. And it's actually twice as many connections in the newborn baby's brain as exists a year later. There's a lot of self-organization. And the brain has the capacity to interact with its environment, make sense of the environment, as well as make sense of its own design and its own interconnections actually continually being repruned and reconnected to make sense of the environment and to learn. And that is really the only approach that's going to work. I think the Psych project of Doug Lennart is interesting, has accomplished a lot, but I never felt that we could build human-level intelligence that way. We really have to build it the way nature builds it, which is a machine that has the capacity to learn, and then provide for its education. Now, neural nets is sort of one attempt based on a crude model of how human neurons work, which actually builds lots of neuron simulators and connects them somewhat the way the brain connects them and lets them self-organize and there's a number of different approaches to neural nets. They're all very simplified from what we now know is true of actual neurons. And as progress in reverse engineering the human brain progresses and we have more sophisticated and realistic models of actual neurons, we can build more realistic biologically inspired paradigms. But in general, pattern recognition, which is my field, works by emulating nature in these self-organizing methods. We set up some approach, which could be a neural net, this thing called Markov models, which is the mathematical cousin of neural nets. There are evolutionary algorithms that actually emulate evolution. And actually part of human learning has a kind of an evolutionary process take place inside the brain for the better connections that survive. And, we use these techniques in our pattern recognition approach. We'll actually simulate evolution, have different solutions to a problem, compete with each other through thousands of generations of simulated evolution. And these biologically inspired methods are very powerful. They give results that are essentially unpredictable, just as sort of human decision-making is unpredictable without actually letting it unfold. And this is really the approach that will work, trying to define as analytic, logical rules every bit of common sense. It's not going to work. It's too complex, too unwieldy, and it's not how human intelligence works.